Life isn't fair, not least in the discrepancy between big men and little men, big reputations and ones that are, unfairly, much smaller. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, the Wright brothers and Lawrence Hargrave, Logie Baird and Henry Sutton, and today John Gould and John Gilbert. Both Johns were birdmen and knew each other, but if you've heard of John Gould, how many know John Gilbert? Well, our own resident birdo, Sue Taylor, is here to help. Sue.
Almost every Australian has heard of John Gould, the birdman, but relatively few people know much about John Gilbert, one of his most able collectors. John Gould and John Gilbert had more in common than their first names and their initials. They were almost the same age. They were both apprenticed as gardeners aged 13 in the King's Garden at Windsor. They both lacked formal education. They were both enthusiastic and dedicated naturalists, expert ornithologists and excellent shots. They were both ranked amongst the best taxidermists in the country. Both were born in England, yet made their mark in Australian ornithology. Both were employed by the Zoological Society in London. With all these similarities and parallels, their lives and deaths could hardly have been more different. Gould died at home in London, aged 78, a rich man. His employee, Gilbert, was killed, aged 42, in outback Queensland as the result of an attack by Aborigines. We will never know the precise circumstances of Gilbert's death. Gould won the position of first curator and preserver at the Zoological Society in London because of his skills as a taxidermist. At the same time, he was operating his own flourishing taxidermy business. It is not possible that he was present at the Zoological Society full-time. Gould recruited Gilbert, 4 years his junior, to work at the Zoological Society. But 18 months later, John Gilbert was sacked for being absent without leave. Evidently, John Gould did not speak up on behalf of Gilbert. Why not? We know that he still valued Gilbert's talents because he provided him with a reference that secured him the position of museum curator at the New Natural History Society of Shrewsbury. Further, Gould employed Gilbert as a collector in Australia. And why was Gilbert absent? What was he doing? It is always dangerous to make judgments 180 years after an event when you don't have all the facts, but it does seem to me a little unfair to sack the junior employee for committing an offence that his boss is permitted to perform. Gilbert came to Australia with Gould in 1838. Gould paid Gilbert £100 per annum plus expenses, but Gilbert was expected to account meticulously for every penny and to keep his expenses as small as possible. The party landed in Hobart in September, and in January Gilbert and Gould travelled overland together to Launceston. Suddenly, I might say impulsively, Gould decided they should separate and sent Gilbert off to Swan River, assuring him that he would look after all his personal possessions then still in Hobart. Gilbert was instructed to collect as many specimens as possible, then meet up with Gould again in Sydney, where Gould would wait for him until the end of April the following year. Gould emphasised that he must husband his resources and spend as little money as possible. So Gilbert went west, alone. Meanwhile, Gould returned to Hobart, where his wife Elizabeth awaited him. They lived in style with their servants in Government House. Taking one servant with him, Gould visited New South Wales and was made welcome by various wealthy landowners. He returned to Hobart just in time for the birth of his 7th child, a son they named Franklin Tasman. Almost immediately, Gould set off again, this time for South Australia, where he met the Governor and accompanied Sturt on his expedition to the Murray Scrubs. When he returned to Hobart, the Goulds travelled together to New South Wales, where Elizabeth's brothers lived. Gould had a wonderful time collecting birds and beasts. There was no one to instruct him to husband his resources. Then, just as suddenly as he decided that Gilbert should sail to Swan River from Launceston, Gould decided that they should all return to England. They left on the 9th of April. Gilbert arrived in Sydney on the 30th of April to find his employer gone. To rub salt into his wounds, his trunk had been ransacked and many of the possessions Gould had promised to protect had been stolen. Gilbert was understandably miffed, and he said so. Nevertheless, Gilbert provided Gould with thousands of specimens of every description, from quadrupeds to insects, from shells to crustacea, from plants to reptiles, but mainly, and most importantly, birds and eggs. Gilbert provided Gould with over 60 new species of birds. Gilbert travelled by boat to Port Essington, north of where Darwin is today. There he collected, amongst many other things, a beautiful new finch. He took it home to Gould in England. He found his employer mourning his wife, Elizabeth, who had died after the birth of their 8th child. She was just 37. Gould named the finch after his wife. So Elizabeth is remembered today in this gorgeous little bird, called not Elizabeth's finch, as you might think, but more cryptically, the Gouldian finch. Gilbert soon returned to Australia to collect again for Gould. He discovered the paradise parrot and thought it, without exception, the most beautiful of the whole tribe I have ever yet seen in Australia. He begged Gould to name it after him, saying, "I know of no species that would delight me more to see Gilbertiae attached to than this beautiful bird." Gould declined, saying he didn't like naming species after people, and anyway, he'd just recently named another species after him. That was Gilbert's whistler. Apparently Gould saw no contradiction in this explanation. Sadly, the paradise parrot is now extinct, but Gilbert is remembered in the Gilbert's whistler. Far better to be remembered in a living whistler than an extinct parrot. Some English writers who have never seen or heard this whistler make much of the fact that it belongs to the group of birds called thickheads. They just show their ignorance. Gilbert's whistler is, without doubt, one of our most glorious songsters and, I believe, one of the most beautiful. There is some irony in the fact that naming the Gilbert's whistler was one of Gould's rare ornithological mistakes. He had already named the eastern race of the same bird, calling it the unadorned thickhead, perhaps giving some indication of what he thought of the bird. By convention, the first name stands, so today the scientific name is Pachycephala inornata. But while, technically speaking, the name Gilbert's whistler refers just to the western race of the bird, the name is used universally today for the species. Gould also honoured Gilbert when naming two animals that Gilbert had collected for him from the dense heath in the southwest of Western Australia, Gilbert's dunnart and Gilbert's potteroo. So Gilbert's name lives on in one beautiful Australian songbird and two cute little critters, both pretty rare. Gould's name, on the other hand, is attached to numerous birds and beasts all over the world. In Australia, I know of 4 birds and 5 animals, but then I might well have missed some. Those I know are 2 petrels, a bronze cuckoo and a flycatcher, 2 bats, a tree rat, a mouse and a sand goanna. In 1844, Gilbert joined Ludwig Leichhardt's expedition from Moreton Bay overland to Port Essington, and it was on this fateful trip that he was killed. He was a late addition to the party, and when, after just a few days, Leichhardt decided that 9 men were too many to feed, Gilbert should have been sent back. However, Gilbert was keen to remain part of the expedition and persuaded someone else to return in his place. Leichhardt did not insist that Gilbert should go. I wonder if he later regretted this decision. It is speculated that Leichhardt could not afford to upset Gilbert's influential English employer, and this may be true. Certainly Leichhardt and Gilbert did not always see eye to eye. They each had a different understanding of the ownership of specimens collected by the expedition, Leichhardt calling Gilbert a thief when Gilbert took specimens belonging to the expedition. Gilbert accused Leichhardt of jealousy and selfishness, of being irrational and arrogant. Leichhardt said Gilbert was malicious and prone to exaggeration. But, as usual, people uttered pleasant platitudes about Gilbert after his death. Gould mourned the loss to science. Leichhardt forgot his criticisms and referred to poor Gilbert and our unfortunate companion. The previously accepted version of Gilbert's death is told by Alec Chisholm in his book Strange Journey, The Adventures of Ludwig Leichhardt and John Gilbert. The story is that Gilbert was speared by Aborigines who attacked Leichhardt's camp at night, killing Gilbert and seriously injuring 2 other members of the party. This hitherto accepted story was questioned by Bruce Simpson in his book In Leichhardt's Footsteps. Simpson suggests that Gilbert was not spared by Aborigines at all, but was killed by friendly fire. That is to say, one of Leichhardt's party, shooting at the Aboriginal attackers in the dark, accidentally shot Gilbert. In the Chisholm version, Gilbert is speared, staggers, pulls out the spear and collapses dead. After the attack, Leichhardt is tending the 2 badly wounded members of his party and asks after Gilbert. He is told Gilbert is dead. He inspects the body but has difficulty in the dark finding the small wound that killed him. Simpson says it is not credible that Gilbert removed a 3-metre-long spear from his neck, leaving just a tiny cut. The small wound Leichhardt found is more consistent with gunshot. We will never know the truth about Gilbert's death, but I can't help thinking that Leichhardt, whose nickname was Doctor, would be able to tell the difference between a wound made by a spear and a wound made by a rifle. It was dark, and he did have notoriously bad eyesight, it is true, but his medical abilities are corroborated by the fact that the 2 injured men survived the ordeal and completed the journey to Port Essington some 6 months later. Leichhardt burnt Gilbert's body, divided his clothes between the rest of the party, and retained his journal and specimens, which he sent to Gould in London. Gould sometimes quoted from Gilbert's journal when writing about birds, yet he gave no indication that he'd read any of Gilbert's disparaging remarks about Leichhardt. The diary was kept amongst Gould's papers, quite forgotten, for many decades. Then, in 1938, most dramatically, it is rediscovered by Alec Chisholm on a trip to England searching for Gould memorabilia for the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Gould's visit to Australia. Now, nearing the 170th anniversary, we are little wiser about the relationship between these 2 fascinating men. Neither of them was perfect. Both have left us a great legacy. There is no doubt that Gould would have expected to be remembered and honoured for his contribution to science. And I suspect that Gilbert would be satisfied with the contribution he made, pleased to have his name remembered in Gilbert's Whistler, and, as ever, accepting of the fact that he must always take a back seat to Gould.
But Sue Taylor never takes a backseat to anyone. She's twitched well over 600 Australian birds and has written delightful books about being a birdo. She lives in Melbourne.